somewhere on this planet, right now, there are 12 men sitting inside cells that were designed specifically so they could never leave. Not just prison cells, not just high-security wings. These are environments engineered from the concrete up to eliminate every possibility of escape, every whisper of outside communication, every trace of the influence these men once held over entire nations. The lights never fully turn off. The walls are thick enough to muffle sound. The guards rotate constantly so no relationships form. And the men inside those cells, men who once commanded private armies, who corrupted presidents, who flooded the streets of America and Europe with billions of dollars worth of narcotics, those men now spend their days measuring the same few square feet of floor space over and over again, going nowhere. This is not a story about ordinary criminals. The 12 men in this documentary were not street-level dealers or mid-level traffickers caught in a sting. These were architects. They built organizations so powerful and so deeply embedded into the social fabric of entire countries that governments did not just want them imprisoned. Governments needed them gone from society permanently, with no possibility of return, because history had already proven, more than once, that keeping these men anywhere close to the outside world was not just dangerous, it was catastrophic. Some of them escaped maximum security prisons through tunnels dug beneath prison floors. Some ran entire drug empires from inside their cells using corrupted guards and smuggled phones. Some ordered murders and renegotiated trafficking routes without ever stepping outside. And some became so synonymous with massacre and brutality that the idea of releasing them back into society is, in the considered judgment of the agencies monitoring them, a genuine national security threat. Throughout this documentary, you will learn how each of these men built his empire, what made him so feared that entire police forces were too compromised to touch him, how authorities finally brought him down after years or decades of pursuit, and why the facilities holding him today represent the absolute outer limit of what modern incarceration looks like. Before we get into the individuals, it helps to understand the environments built to contain them. The United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, ADEX Florence, the Supermax, is the most secure federal prison in America. Inmates spend between 22 and 24 hours per day in single cells measuring 7 by 12 feet. The furniture is poured concrete built into the walls. Natural light enters through a narrow slit. Movement happens in full restraints through a series of electronically controlled doors that open one at a time. There is no communal dining, no communal yard. Exercise happens alone in individual cages. Communication is restricted to monitored contact with lawyers and immediate family under special administrative measures, known as SAMs, which can impose near total communication blackouts on specific individuals. Mexico's equivalent, Ceferezo No. 1 at Almoloya de Juarez, El Altiplano, was considered equally impenetrable until Joaquin Guzman walked out of it in 2015. That escape is precisely why many of these men ended up in American custody instead. And we begin with him. Now little did the outside world fully appreciate, when these men were first being arrested and processed through their respective justice systems, just how long and how complex the road to their final imprisonment would be. The legal battles surrounding the most significant cartel captures have taken years, sometimes decades, to resolve. Extradition alone, the process of transferring a prisoner from Mexican or Colombian custody to a U.S. federal court, often required years of diplomatic negotiation, judicial proceedings in multiple countries, and legal challenges that tested the limits of international law. For much of the late 20th century, extradition from Mexico to the United States was politically and legally complicated to the point of near impossibility. The Mexican Constitution contained provisions making extradition of nationals extremely difficult. And political sentiment in Mexico was deeply resistant to what many saw as an infringement on national sovereignty. The result was that cartel figures who operated in Mexico faced relatively limited consequences under domestic law, shorter sentences, conditions more vulnerable to corruption, rather than the far harsher American federal sentences. That changed in the late 1990s and early 2000s, as constitutional reforms removed the most significant legal barriers to extradition, and successive Mexican governments concluded that cartel power had rendered the domestic justice system inadequate for its most significant criminal figures. The extradition of Ociel Cárdenas Guillén in 2007 was a landmark. The extradition of El Chapo in 2017, after 2 escapes and a global manhunt, established the defining precedent. No matter how powerful, no matter how many escapes, no matter how vast the corruption network, the system would eventually close around a captured cartel leader. Each of the 12 men in this documentary represents a case where that process, however long it took, eventually reached its conclusion. Number 12. Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Loera, El Chapo. Born April 4, 1957, in La Tuna, Badiraguato, Sinaloa, one of the most remote and impoverished communities in Mexico, a mountain region with a long historical relationship with marijuana and poppy cultivation. He left school after 3rd grade. By his teenage years, he was working for local drug farmers. By the early 1980s, he had caught the attention of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the head of the Guadalajara cartel and the dominant figure in Mexican organized crime at the time, who recognized in him an exceptional operational and logistics mind. Guzman rose quickly, becoming a coordinator for cocaine shipments moving north on behalf of Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel. When Félix Gallardo was arrested in 1989 and his empire fragmented, Guzman took control of the Sinaloa corridor into Arizona and California and began building what U.S. prosecutors would eventually call the largest and most prolific drug trafficking organization in the world. What Guzman built was genuinely industrial. He pioneered the large-scale use of cross-border tunnels. Over 100 have been discovered along the U.S.-Mexico border over the years, many attributed to the Sinaloa cartel, some stretching more than a mile underground with rail systems, ventilation, and electric lighting. A single tunnel discovered near the San Diego-Tijuana border in 2011 yielded 32 tons of marijuana in one seizure. Beyond tunnels, the organization used narco-submarines, semi-submersible vessels capable of carrying multi-ton cocaine loads across thousands of miles of open ocean, catapults that launched drugs over border fencing, cocaine dissolved into gasoline and transported in tanker trucks, then chemically extracted on the American side, and legitimate-looking business shipments, including cocaine, dissolved into liquid form and repacked inside frozen jalapeno peppers. The DEA estimates the Sinaloa cartel generated between $3 and $20 billion annually at its peak, making it by some measures the wealthiest criminal enterprise in the world. The corruption network was equally sophisticated. Trial testimony from more than 50 witnesses at Guzman's 2019 New York trial described monthly bribe payments to local police commanders at standardized rates, corrupted military checkpoints on key highway corridors, airport customs agents on the cartel payroll, and a corruption infrastructure that cooperating witness testimony alleged reached the highest levels of the Mexican government. When corruption failed, violence followed. The Sinaloa Juarez cartel war for control of the Ciudad Juarez trafficking corridor made that city the most dangerous in the world by homicide rate, recording over 3,000 murders in 2010 alone in a city of 1.5 million people. Dismembered bodies appeared on public streets with messages attached. Car bombs detonated in civilian areas. the Mexican military deployed tens of thousands of soldiers to contain the carnage. Guzman was first arrested in Guatemala in 1993 and imprisoned at Puente Grande prison in Jalisco. He then spent years systematically corrupting the prison from within, purchasing the cooperation of the director and dozens of guards, holding meetings with cartel associates inside, continuing to run the organization through coded messages and personal intermediaries, before escaping in January 2001 in a laundry cart, pushed by a corrupted staff member. He spent 13 years at large in the Sierra Madre Mountains, protected by a network of lookouts and corrupted officials, before recapture in Mazatlan in February 2014. He was placed in El Altiplano, Mexico's most secure prison. 14 months later, on July 11, 2015, he stepped into his shower, dropped into a tunnel entrance beneath the floor, and disappeared through a professionally constructed passageway more than a mile long, with electric lighting, ventilation, and a motorcycle rail system inside that had taken more than a year to build and required knowledge of the prison's architectural plans. He was recaptured January 8, 2016, in Los Mochis, Sinaloa, extradited to the United States January 19, 2017, convicted on all 10 counts in February 2019 by a jury in the Eastern District of New York, sentenced in July 2019 to life plus 30 years with forfeiture of more than $12 billion. He is currently held at Adex Florence under SAMs that restrict his communication to monitored contact with lawyers and immediate family only. His 2 escapes from maximum security Mexican facilities are precisely why those restrictions exist. And what those restrictions mean in practice is this: a man who once ran the world's largest drug trafficking organization, who survived 2 arrests and 2 of the most famous prison escapes in the history of organized crime, who built a tunnel beneath his shower using the architectural plans of Mexico's most secure prison, now spends his days in a room where the furniture is made of concrete and cannot be moved, where the lights never fully turn off, where the only human voices he hears belong to lawyers, family members on monitored calls, and rotating correctional officers instructed never to form relationships with inmates. The distance between what he was and what he is now is one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of organized crime. And it was produced, ultimately, by 2 governments that refused to accept that any individual was too powerful or too resourceful to be permanently contained. Number 11. Ismael Mario Zambada Garcia. If Guzman was the face of the Sinaloa cartel, Zambada was its brain. Born January 1, 1948 in Culiacan, Sinaloa, and known as El Mayo, he co-founded the Sinaloa cartel alongside Guzman and served as its most strategically significant leader for more than 5 decades. Where Guzman was the logistics innovator and public face, Zambada managed the organization's relationships with Colombian cocaine suppliers, with corrupt officials at every institutional level, with rival organizations that required negotiation rather than confrontation, and with the financial infrastructure that moved and laundered the cartel's revenues. He never gave interviews. He avoided photographs to such a degree that the few images of him in law enforcement files were obtained over decades at significant intelligence cost. He avoided narco-corrido celebrations and the gold-plated weapons and ostentatious vehicles that drew attention to rivals. He communicated through intermediaries, moved constantly through rural Sinaloa, and changed his protocols whenever someone close to him was arrested. Zambada's operational security was considered by senior DIA officials to be the most sophisticated they had encountered from any individual cartel leader. He structured every aspect of his life to minimize intelligence exposure. He never used a cell phone in a way that created a traceable pattern. He moved between properties in rural Sinaloa and the Sierra Madre Mountains on irregular schedules. He used trusted couriers for all communication rather than any electronic channel that could be intercepted. He maintained buffers of loyal intermediaries between himself and every significant decision, so that even when those intermediaries were arrested and cooperated with prosecutors, their knowledge of his location was days or weeks out of date. The few people who had direct physical access to him were drawn from a small circle of family members and lifelong associates whose own exposure to law enforcement was minimal. He had watched Felix Gallardo go to prison, watched the Medellin cartel destroyed by its own visibility, watched El Chapo captured twice by his willingness to meet with journalists and filmmakers. He drew the correct conclusion from every one of those examples and built his life around their opposite. The DIA assessed Zambada as the longest-serving active cartel leader in Mexican history, a man who survived 2 of Guzman's arrests, the catastrophic Beltran-Leyva split, the cartel wars of the 2000s, the sustained bilateral enforcement pressure of the 2010s, and the entire generational turnover of the organizations around him, while virtually everyone else was killed or captured. U.S. federal indictments charge him with conspiring to traffic cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana into the United States over more than 2 decades. Prosecutors allege he personally oversaw the management of smuggling routes, the recruitment and payment of corrupt officials, and the authorization of violence against rivals and potential informants. Multiple cooperating witnesses have testified in American legal proceedings about specific murders they allege Zambada ordered or approved. On July 25, 2024, he arrived at a small airport in Santa Teresa, New Mexico, apparently expecting a meeting, and was arrested by U.S. law enforcement. His defense alleged he was kidnapped, bound, and involuntarily transported across the border. Alongside him was Joaquin Guzman Lopez, El Chapo's son, whose apparent role in the events created enormous tension within the Sinaloa organization and raised serious questions about betrayal at the highest cartel levels. Zambada has pleaded not guilty to charges including drug trafficking and murder conspiracy. He remains in federal custody. The prospect of him ever living freely again appears remote in the extreme. And yet Zambada's arrest itself raises a question that law enforcement officials and organized crime analysts are still working through. What does it mean when a figure of Zambada's stature and operational sophistication ends up in American custody, not through years of surveillance and an intelligence-driven capture operation, but apparently through the actions of someone within the cartel itself? The internal dynamics of the Sinaloa cartel in the aftermath of El Chapo's imprisonment, the succession struggles, the factional alignments, the question of who would control what, clearly produced pressures that ultimately resulted in one of the organization's most senior figures being delivered to American law enforcement. If that is what happened, it suggests that the long-term consequence of removing El Chapo from the picture was an internal destabilization that eventually turned the organization's own logic against one of its founders. That is a kind of justice that no law enforcement operation could have engineered, and it is worth noting. Number 10. Miguel Ángel Trevino Morales. Born September 18, 1970, in Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, and known as Z40, Trevino represents a category of cartel leadership built not on trafficking efficiency, but on the systematic deployment of extreme violence as an organizational tool. He was one of 15 children, grew up in poverty, crossed into Texas as a teenager, and worked odd jobs in Dallas before returning to Mexico. He entered the criminal world through Los Zetas, the Gulf Cartel's enforcement wing formed by deserters from Mexico's elite GAFE's Special Forces unit, rising not as a former soldier, but as an enforcer whose willingness to carry out acts of violence that others refused made him indispensable. Trevino's rise within the Zetas illustrated a specific dynamic in criminal organizations, that extreme violence, deployed consistently and visibly enough, creates a kind of deterrence that substitutes for the kind of corruption and negotiation that other cartel leaders use to manage their environments. Where the Sinaloa cartel paid off officials and maintained relationships, the Zetas under Trevino's influence used the threat and reality of extreme consequences to achieve compliance. Communities throughout northeastern Mexico knew what the Zetas were capable of and adjusted their behavior accordingly. This created a zone of control that was in some ways more absolute than anything corruption alone could purchase, but it also created the kind of documented atrocity record that eventually drew the sustained attention of Mexican military forces, the DEA, the FBI, and international human rights organizations in ways that more subtle organizations managed to avoid. Under his influence, Los Zetas used what became known in the criminal underworld as the guiso, burning bodies in barrels of diesel fuel to destroy evidence and communicate consequences to anyone watching. When the Zetas formally broke from the Gulf Cartel in 2010, and Trevino became the operational enforcer under leader Heriberto Lascano, the organization expanded through extortion, taxing every business in territory it controlled, kidnapping for ransom, theft of crude oil from Pemex pipelines across northeastern Mexico, and the forced occupation of entire communities. In August 2010, Zetas gunmen stopped 72 Central and South American migrants in San Fernando, Tamaulipas, and executed them when the migrants refused to work as cartel mules. A single wounded survivor managed to reach a military checkpoint. When Marines responded, they found the bodies stacked inside a ranch building. The massacre drew international condemnation. It was followed in 2011 by the discovery of mass graves in the same municipality containing the remains of more than 190 additional victims. Passengers pulled from buses traveling through Tamaulipas, forced to fight each other before being killed. Journalists who reported on these events were targeted. Several were murdered. Newsrooms across northeastern Mexico practiced self-censorship that international press freedom organizations documented as among the most severe in the Western Hemisphere outside active war zones. When Lascano was killed by Mexican Marines in October 2012, Trevino assumed full command. He held it for less than a year. On July 15, 2013, helicopter-borne Mexican military forces intercepted his vehicle convoy before dawn near Anahuac, Nuevo León. He is held in Mexican federal custody on organized crime, drug trafficking, and homicide charges. Extradition proceedings to the United States, where he faces indictments in multiple federal districts, remain ongoing. Number 9. Omar Trevino Morales. Born January 21, 1972, and known as Z42, Omar was the organizational successor when his brother Miguel Ángel was captured in 2013. He had already served in senior operational roles during the Zetas' peak years, managing the organization's activities across Coahuila and the Tamaulipas border zone. The Zetas under his watch and his brother's leadership collected extortion taxes from every business operating in territories they controlled, from large commercial enterprises down to street vendors. Anyone who refused to pay faced violence against themselves or their families. Under Omar's leadership, after his brother's arrest, the already weakened organization continued fragmenting into competing regional factions, each developing its own command structure and revenue streams. The fragmentation did not end the criminal enterprise. It made it more chaotic and in some ways harder to dismantle, because there was no single command node to strike. Omar was captured March 4, 2015, in the affluent San Pedro Garza Garcia municipality near Monterrey, Nuevo León, in an intelligence-driven operation supported by informant reporting and sustained surveillance. He faces organized crime, trafficking, and homicide charges in Mexico, with American extradition proceedings pending. He remains in Mexican federal custody. The fragmentation of Los Zetas that accelerated under Omar's leadership after 2013 is itself an important lesson in how criminal organizations evolve under sustained enforcement pressure. Rather than collapsing when its central leadership was removed, the Zetas adapted into a more distributed model, different factions controlling different territories under different local leaders, sharing a brand name and a certain operational heritage, but without meaningful central coordination. This made the organization simultaneously weaker in terms of strategic capability and more resilient in terms of survivability. Law enforcement could no longer achieve the decisive organizational impact of capturing a single leader. They were now facing something that functioned more like a franchise than a hierarchy. The pattern has been replicated by other organizations facing similar pressure and represents one of the most significant adaptive challenges in modern drug enforcement. Number 8. Alfredo Beltran Leyva. Known as El Mochomo, born 1971 in Badiraguato, Sinaloa, Alfredo was the youngest of 5 brothers who were not junior partners in the Sinaloa Alliance, but co-architects of it. The Beltran Leyva brothers managed the cartel's critical Colombian cocaine supply relationships and oversaw importation logistics, the reception of multi-ton loads from Colombia and their movement northward through Mexican territory toward the United States. They maintained supplier connections that were among the most valuable assets the Sinaloa cartel possessed. Alfredo also, according to testimony from cooperating witnesses, was involved in authorizing violence to protect the organization's supply chains and operations. When Alfredo was arrested by Mexican federal forces on January 21, 2008, in Culiacan, Sinaloa, the remaining brothers became convinced, based on intelligence received from inside the Sinaloa organization, that Guzman himself had provided the information leading to the arrest in exchange for continued government protection of himself and his operations. Whether this was true or not, the belief destroyed an alliance built over decades. The Beltran Leyva organization broke from the Sinaloa cartel, allied with the Juarez cartel and later Los Zetas, recruited hundreds of new enforcers, including a group that became the Guerreros Unidos in Guerrero State, and launched assassination campaigns across multiple states. Their gunmen killed Edgar Guzman Lopez, El Chapo's son, in a Culiacan parking lot in 2008, a direct and unmistakable message to his father. The resulting cartel war killed thousands of people between 2008 and 2010. Alfredo sat in Mexican custody throughout all of it. He was extradited to the United States in May 2019, pleaded guilty to drug trafficking charges in a Chicago federal court, and was sentenced to life in January 2021. He is currently serving that sentence in the federal prison system. The Beltran Leyva organization's war against the Sinaloa cartel, following Alfredo's 2008 arrest, illustrates how profoundly the internal dynamics of criminal organizations can be disrupted by a single arrest when that arrest is, or is perceived to be, the result of betrayal rather than ordinary enforcement. The violence that followed the split was not simply competitive, it was personal, driven by a sense of betrayal that the surviving Beltran Leyva brothers reportedly spoke about explicitly. They had trusted Guzman with their lives and their freedom for decades. If they believed he had sold one of them to preserve himself, no business calculation or territorial logic could contain the fury that followed. The Guerrero State branch of the organization eventually evolved into the Guerreros Unidos, which became entangled in the events surrounding the disappearance of 43 student teachers in Iguala in September 2014, one of the most significant human rights disasters in Mexican history, and one with a direct lineage back to the cartel fracture that Alfredo's arrest initiated. Number 7. Ociel Cardenas Guillén. Born May 18, 1967, in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, Cardenas Guillén rose within the Gulf Cartel, one of Mexico's oldest trafficking organizations, with established operations along the Texas border going back decades, by eliminating rivals, including childhood friends and close allies, until he controlled the organization in the late 1990s. His methods for securing power were brutal, creating a long list of enemies that made his personal security an acute concern. The decision he made in response to that concern would reshape Mexican organized crime for the next 2 decades. He recruited deserters from the GAFES, Mexico's elite special forces unit, trained with assistance from American and Israeli military advisors, to serve as his personal security force and the Gulf Cartel's military wing. Those soldiers, led initially by Arturo Guzman de Sena, known as Z1, became Los Zetas. They brought military-grade training in combat tactics, weapon systems, intelligence gathering, and counterintelligence that transformed the Gulf Cartel into an organization capable of engaging law enforcement in open confrontation and winning. In March 2002, when DEA agents and U.S. Marshals working alongside Mexican soldiers attempted to arrest Cardenas Guillén in Matamoros, Zetas forces armed with military weapons confronted them directly, and he escaped. He was arrested on March 14, 2003, in a larger follow-up operation conducted with greater force. Held at La Palma prison, he continued directing Gulf Cartel operations through corrupted staff for a period before restrictions were tightened. He was extradited to the United States in January 2007, pleaded guilty to drug trafficking in 2010 in the Southern District of Texas, and was sentenced to 25 years. He is currently serving that sentence. Los Zetas, born from his decision to militarize his security, outlasted his freedom by more than a decade, and produced consequences. The Trevino brothers, the San Fernando massacres, the transformation of cartel violence across northeastern Mexico that reverberate to this day. What Cardenas Guillén ultimately left behind was a template, one that demonstrated, more clearly than anything that came before it, that a criminal organization with access to military training and discipline could challenge the Mexican state in ways that conventional criminal organizations could not. The Zetas were the proof of concept for a militarized cartel model that subsequent organizations have studied and adapted. When the Sijing acquired rocket launchers and armored vehicles and began ambushing military convoys, when the Sinaloa cartel developed its own armed wing, capable of engaging security forces in pitched battle, they were building on the precedent that Cardenas Guillén's decision to hire soldiers had established. His legacy is inseparable from the transformation of Mexican organized crime into something that international security analysts now routinely describe in terms previously reserved for insurgent military forces rather than criminal enterprises. The broader implication of what Cardenas Guillén created with Los Zetas extends well beyond his own criminal career. By bringing military training and discipline into a criminal organization, he demonstrated a model that other groups subsequently imitated and adapted. The Jeng has its own military-style training programs for recruits. Multiple other Mexican and Central American criminal organizations have adopted tactical approaches that trace their lineage to innovations Los Zetas pioneered. The idea that a criminal organization could function like a military force, with ranks, operational security protocols, trained personnel, and genuine tactical capability, was not new in global organized crime. But Los Zetas brought it to Mexico with a sophistication and destructive effectiveness that permanently changed what Mexican security forces faced and what Mexican society had to contend with. Now let us step back for a moment and consider the broader arc of what these organizations built, because understanding that arc helps explain why these 12 men ended up where they are today. The drug trafficking organizations that rose to dominance in Mexico from the late 1980s onward were not simply criminal enterprises. They were responses to specific historical and economic conditions. The collapse of the Colombian cocaine cartels, the Medellin cartel following Pablo Escobar's death in December 1993, the Cali cartel dismantled by the mid-1990s, created a vacuum in cocaine distribution infrastructure. Mexican organizations that had been serving as transportation contractors for the Colombians, moving cocaine through Mexico in exchange for fees, suddenly found themselves positioned to take over the entire distribution chain. They stopped accepting transportation fees and started taking payment in cocaine, which they then sold directly to American wholesale buyers. This shift captured the far more lucrative portion of the value chain and transformed Mexican trafficking organizations from service providers into principal distributors. It also intensified competition between Mexican organizations for control of the specific border crossing points, the plazas, through which drugs entered the United States, because controlling a plaza meant controlling access to what was, in economic terms, one of the most profitable commercial routes in the world. That competition drove the cartel wars that defined Mexico's security crisis from the mid-2000s onward, and produced the environment in which figures like the Trevino brothers rose to power through violence rather than negotiation. The men on this list are products of that environment as much as they are creators of it, and the institutions built to contain them. ADX Florence. El Altiplano before its security failures, the federal extradition machinery that eventually delivered most of them to American courts, are responses to the challenge those men and their organizations represented. Number 6. Dairo Antonio Usuga David. Born April 15, 1974, in Turbo, Antioquia, Colombia, and known as Otoniel. He had a destructive and complicated trajectory through Colombia's decades-long armed conflict, moving through the left-wing guerrilla FARC, the paramilitary peasant self-defense forces of Córdoba and Urabá, and the broader United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or OC, before emerging as the leader of the Gulf Clan, the organization that grew from the OC's criminal infrastructure after that group's nominal demobilization between 2003 and 2006. Under his leadership, the Gulf Clan became Colombia's dominant criminal organization, with several thousand armed fighters and a presence in more than 300 municipalities across the country. The organization moved multi-ton cocaine shipments to markets in North America, Europe, and increasingly Asia and Australia. It taxed coca farmers, illegal gold miners, small drug retailers, and businesses in territories it controlled. It maintained armed confrontation with Colombian security forces, rival criminal groups, and FARC dissident factions simultaneously. Colombian authorities called him the most dangerous drug trafficker the country had produced since Pablo Escobar. He spent years as Colombia's most wanted fugitive, moving constantly through the dense jungle terrain of the Urabá region, communicating through couriers rather than electronic devices, never remaining more than a few nights in the same location. Operation Osiris, conducted October 23, 2021, deployed more than 500 soldiers and police, supported by military helicopters and years of accumulated signals and human intelligence, to capture him alive in the Urabá region of Antioquia. Colombian President Iván Duque announced the arrest in a nationally televised address, calling it the biggest security achievement in Colombia since the killing of Pablo Escobar. Usuga David was extradited to the United States on May 4, 2022, pleaded guilty in a Brooklyn federal court in August 2023 to drug trafficking charges, and was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. He is currently held in the U.S. federal system. The Gulf Clan's survival and growth after the OC demobilization illustrates a pattern that criminologists and policy analysts have documented across multiple post-conflict environments. The reconfiguration of paramilitary criminal networks into nominally civilian criminal organizations that maintain territorial control, revenue streams, and armed capacity while shedding the political ideology that originally justified their existence. Usuga David was not ideologically committed to the paramilitary's original anti-guerrilla mission. He was committed to the revenue and power that the networks the paramilitaries had built could generate. His ability to navigate the transition from armed political actor to transnational criminal leader, surviving demobilization processes, emerging on the other side with an organization intact, and eventually building it into something that Colombian authorities described as the most significant organized crime threat the country had faced since Escobar, reflects an operational adaptability that law enforcement struggled to match for nearly 2 decades. Number 5. Abigail Gonzalez Valencia. Behind the Jalisco New Generation cartel's explosive rise to power, the military helicopter it shot down with a rocket launcher in 2015, the 15 state police officers it ambushed and killed in Michoacan in 2019 using armored vehicles. The vehicle bombs detonated in public spaces, the bodies left hanging from bridges across Mexican cities, was a financial architecture that most people watching the cartel's violence never heard about. That architecture ran through a network called Los Queenies, led by Abigail Gonzalez Valencia. Born in 1974 in Jalisco, and the brother-in-law of Sijing leader Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, Gonzalez Valencia built the money laundering infrastructure that made everything else possible. Los Queenies used legitimate businesses, real estate development, cattle ranching operations, restaurant chains, agricultural enterprises spanning multiple Mexican states as vehicles for absorbing the Chang's drug revenues. Shell companies registered across Mexico, Latin America, the United States, and European financial centers layered and transferred funds in ways that made tracing the money's origin extremely difficult. Bulk street-level narco cash moved through currency exchange businesses and remittance operations, emerging on paper as legitimate commercial wire transfers between registered companies. The scale of the operation, as described in American indictments and investigative reporting, was commensurate with the scale of the CEGNG itself, a multi-country financial system managed with a sophistication that American prosecutors described as rivaling major legitimate financial enterprises. Gonzalez Valencia was arrested by Mexican federal forces in January 2015 in Zapopan, Jalisco. After years of contested extradition proceedings during which his legal team challenged every aspect of the process, he was transferred to U.S. custody and faces federal charges in the Northern District of Illinois and other jurisdictions for drug trafficking and money laundering. His case established important precedent for American prosecutors pursuing cartel financial networks rather than limiting prosecution to the trafficking operations alone. The Los Queenies case represents a significant evolution in how American prosecutors have approached major cartel prosecution. For most of the history of U.S. drug enforcement, the primary focus of major cartel prosecutions was the trafficking operation itself, the importation and distribution of controlled substances, with charges built around the drugs and the people who moved them. The recognition that targeting the financial infrastructure of cartel organizations, the money laundering networks, the shell companies, the corrupt business fronts, could be at least as disruptive as targeting the trafficking operation, and potentially more so because financial networks are harder to rebuild quickly than trafficking routes, has shaped a new generation of prosecutorial strategy. Gonzalez Valencia's case contributed to that evolution, establishing legal frameworks and investigative precedents that prosecutors have applied to subsequent financial investigations of major cartel organizations. Number 4. Juan Carlos Ramirez Abadia. Known as Chupeta, born 1964 in Colombia, Ramirez Abadia was one of the most significant and most operationally active figures within the Norte del Valle cartel, the organization that emerged from the wreckage of the Medellin and Cali cartels in the mid-1990s, deliberately designed to be less centralized and less visible than either predecessor. At its peak, the Norte del Valle cartel moved a substantial share of the cocaine entering the United States, while attracting far less international attention than earlier Colombian organizations, despite comparable trafficking volumes. Ramirez Abadia managed cocaine export operations, shipping multi-ton loads from Colombia through Central America and Mexico to U.S. markets. American prosecutors allege he authorized or ordered the murders of multiple individuals, rivals, potential witnesses, and members of his own organization, suspected of disloyalty or cooperation with authorities over the course of his career. The Norte del Valle cartel's internal discipline, like that of every Colombian trafficking organization of the era, was enforced through credible and regularly demonstrated violence, and Ramirez Abadia was among those identified as personally exercising that authority. Understanding that his photograph was in the hands of Colombian and American law enforcement, and that physical recognition was his primary vulnerability, he undertook a years-long campaign of transformation, undergoing more than half a dozen plastic surgery procedures, altering his nose, cheeks, chin, ears, and other facial features to make himself unrecognizable. He maintained at least 3 separate false identities, kept residences in multiple countries simultaneously, and managed his criminal operation through layers of intermediaries designed to keep his physical location unknown. He was finally arrested by Brazilian federal police in São Paulo in August 2007. His appearance so thoroughly altered that identification at the time of arrest required fingerprint confirmation. He was extradited to the United States, cooperated with American prosecutors providing information about Norte del Valle cartel operations, and is currently serving his federal sentence. Ramirez Abadia's years-long physical transformation to evade recognition illustrates the extraordinary resources and commitment that senior cartel figures are willing to invest in personal operational security. Most law enforcement identification systems in the 1990s and early 2000s relied heavily on photographic recognition, and his decision to systematically alter his face was a rational response to that vulnerability. The fact that it worked for years, allowing him to move through multiple countries under false identities while continuing to manage significant trafficking operations, underscores how sophisticated the personal security calculations of senior traffickers had become by the time the Norte del Valle cartel was at its peak. His eventual capture in Brazil, far from Colombia, under a false identity and identifiable only through fingerprints, is itself a testament to how thoroughly he had managed to disappear into alternative identities while remaining operationally active. Number 3. Rafael Caro Quintero. There are cases that define an era. The murder of DEA Special Agent Enrique Camarena is one of them, a case that permanently altered the relationship between the United States and Mexico on drug enforcement matters and created an institutional commitment within the DEA that has not faded in 40 years. Caro Quintero was born October 3, 1952, in Badiraguato, Sinaloa, the same mountain municipality that produced El Chapo and Alfredo Beltran Leyva, and became one of the most powerful figures in the Guadalajara cartel. He developed massive marijuana cultivation operations in Chihuahua, most notably a facility called El Bufalo, that was at the time of its discovery by American and Mexican agents in 1984, one of the largest marijuana plantations ever found anywhere in the world. El Bufalo covered thousands of acres and was operated by hundreds of laborers under conditions that investigators described as forced labor, with workers living in camps and unable to leave. The scale of the operation made Caro Quintero one of the wealthiest men in Mexico. The 9 years that Caro Quintero spent as a fugitive after his 2013 release, living in the Sinaloa Mountains, reportedly maintaining connections to trafficking networks, moving carefully to avoid the American law enforcement agencies that had never stopped looking for him, are a reminder of how the Sierra Madre region of Sinaloa functions as a sanctuary for individuals with sufficient money, community relationships, and knowledge of the terrain. His recapture in July 2022, nearly 40 years after Camarena's murder, came through a Mexican Marines operation that reflected the accumulated intelligence and sustained commitment that the DEA and American government had maintained toward this case through multiple administrations and across nearly 4 decades. For the DEA, his recapture was not just a law enforcement achievement. It was a statement about institutional memory and institutional commitment that the agency considered important to make. On February 7, 1985, DEA agent Enrique Camarena was abducted from the street directly outside the American consulate in Guadalajara in broad daylight by men working for the Guadalajara Cartel. Camarena had spent years conducting deep undercover investigations into the cartel's operations and had developed intelligence that directly threatened the organization's leadership. His body and that of his pilot, Alfredo Zavala Avalar, were found March 5, 1985, on a ranch in Michoacan. Both had been tortured for more than 30 hours before their deaths. The torture sessions were recorded on audio tape. Those recordings were later obtained by American investigators and used as evidence. Everyone in the DEA who heard them was changed by the experience. The abduction of a DEA agent from in front of the American consulate in broad daylight, an act that reflected the cartel's absolute confidence in its government protection. And the brutality of what followed made this the defining moment in the history of American counter-narcotics operations in Mexico. Operation Leyenda, the investigation that followed, became the largest in DEA history and fundamentally transformed U.S.-Mexico counter-narcotics relations. Caro Quintero was arrested in Costa Rica in April 1985 and returned to Mexico, where he was convicted and sentenced to 40 years. In August 2013, a Mexican federal judge released him on a legal technicality, ruling he had been tried in the wrong court. The release caused an international crisis. He spent 9 more years as a fugitive before Mexican Marines recaptured him in the Sinaloa Mountains on July 15, 2022. He is held in Mexican federal custody. A New York federal court has indicted him on drug trafficking and murder conspiracy charges related to Camarena's death. Extradition proceedings are ongoing. Number 2. Benjamin Arellano Felix. Born March 11, 1952, Benjamin was the organizational mind behind the Arellano Felix organization, the Tijuana Cartel, which dominated the San Diego-Tijuana border crossing through the 1990s and into the early 2000s. That crossing is the single busiest land border crossing in the world, and controlling it meant controlling one of the most lucrative drug trafficking corridors on the continent. While his brother Ramon served as the organization's chief enforcer and primary killer, Benjamin managed strategy, Colombian cocaine supplier relationships, and the corruption network that kept Baja California's law enforcement and political establishment sufficiently compromised to allow uninterrupted operations. The cartel at its peak generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually from cocaine, heroin, and marijuana, moving northward through Tijuana into California, and from there to distribution points across the United States. Its enforcers included members of a street gang recruited from the Logan Heights neighborhood of San Diego, who were brought to Tijuana as contract killers in exchange for drugs and money. A cross-border criminal arrangement that itself illustrated the extent to which the organization's operations were woven into the fabric of communities on both sides of the border. In May 1993, Roman Catholic Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo was shot and killed at the Guadalajara airport. Mexican federal investigators attributed the killing to the Arellano Felix organization, theorizing the cardinal's vehicle convoy was mistaken for that of Joaquin Guzman, who was at the same airport that day and whom the Tijuana cartel was actively trying to kill. The killing of a Catholic cardinal in a major Mexican airport in broad daylight illustrated with terrible clarity how untouchable the organization believed itself to be. Benjamin was arrested in Puebla in March 2002. His brother Ramon was killed by Mexican police the same year. Benjamin was extradited to the United States in April 2011, pleaded guilty to drug trafficking and conspiracy in the Southern District of California, and is currently serving his sentence in the federal prison system. The decline of the Tijuana cartel following Benjamin's arrest and Ramon's death illustrates how organizational structures built around family loyalty can be both strengthened and made fragile by that same foundation. The Arellano Felix brothers trusted each other in ways they trusted few outsiders, and that trust made the organization coherent and disciplined at its peak. But it also meant that when key brothers were removed through death or capture, the replacements who came from outside the founding family circle had neither the authority nor the loyalty networks necessary to maintain organizational cohesion. The Tijuana cartel was progressively displaced from its most valuable territories by the Sinaloa cartel in the years following Benjamin's removal, a process that the remaining brothers and their successors were unable to reverse, and that eventually reduced the organization from one of the dominant powers in Mexican organized crime to a significantly diminished regional actor. Number 1. Eric Valencia Salazar. Known as L85, Valencia Salazar is a co-founder of the organization that today stands as one of the most powerful and most feared drug trafficking operations in the world, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the Ching. Born in the 1970s in Jalisco, he rose through the Milenio Cartel, a Jalisco-based organization with historical ties to the Sinaloa Alliance, before joining with Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, and other figures to form the King around 2010 and 2011, following the Milenio Cartel's collapse. The new organization's founding strategy was built around aggressive confrontation, declaring war on Los Zetas and positioning itself publicly as a defender of communities against Zeta extortion. That framing, whether strategically calculated or genuinely felt, gave the CGing popular cover for rapid territorial expansion across Jalisco and the Pacific Coast Corridor of Mexico. Within a decade, the CGing had established a presence across more than 20 Mexican states, shot down a Mexican military helicopter with a rocket launcher in 2015, ambushed and killed 15 state police officers in Michoacan in 2019, using armored vehicles and heavy weapons, detonated vehicle bombs in public civilian spaces, and established cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl distribution networks on multiple continents. Valencia Salazar oversaw cocaine distribution operations in the CJN's early period and helped build the organizational infrastructure that made that expansion possible. He was arrested by Mexican federal forces in 2012 at an early stage of the organization's development, before the CJN had reached its eventual scale. What followed illustrated one of the most persistent failures in Mexico's handling of major cartel figures. He was eventually released from custody, drawing sharp criticism from law enforcement officials who argued the legal case had not been properly sustained. He was later recaptured. He is currently held in Mexican federal custody under extraordinary security measures, with American extradition proceedings active. The Ching, despite his incarceration, despite the ongoing manhunt for El Mencho, continues to expand. The organization was built from the beginning with a resilience that allows it to absorb the loss of individual leaders, decentralized command, multiple independent cells, diversified revenue streams, and it is demonstrating that resilience every day. Valencia Salazar's case also illustrates something important about the relationship between founding figures and the organizations they help create. The CJNG grew beyond any individual founder's personal control relatively quickly, developing institutional momentum, internal leadership structures, and operational capabilities that made it survivable regardless of what happened to any specific individual. His arrest in 2012 did not prevent the CJNG's subsequent decade of extraordinary expansion. His release and recapture did not meaningfully disrupt the organization's operations in either direction. The Chung is no longer primarily the creation of any individual, including El Mencho himself. It is an institution with its own leadership structures, regional commanders, financial systems, and accumulated organizational knowledge that will persist regardless of what happens to its founders. That institutional maturity is precisely what makes the CJNG the sustained national security challenge that multiple American government agencies have formally designated it as being. It is worth pausing here, before we reach our final reflection, to think more carefully about what it actually means to be held at ADEX Florence, because the clinical description of the facility does not fully capture what the experience represents for the men inside it. ADEX Florence holds roughly 400 inmates at any given time. It is not exclusively a cartel prison. Its population includes domestic terrorists, foreign terrorist organization members, and individuals convicted of various categories of federal crime who have demonstrated through behavior in other facilities that they cannot be managed in conventional maximum security environments. Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, died there in 2023. Ramzi Youssef, who helped plan the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, is held there. The facility opened in 1994 specifically because the federal prison system had concluded that existing maximum security facilities were inadequate for its most dangerous inmates. A typical day for an inmate in the highest security tier begins before dawn with a count, one of multiple counts conducted every 24 hours. There is no communal dining. Meals are delivered through a slot in the cell door. Exercise happens alone in a cage. Human contact with anyone outside the monitoring structure is governed by SAMs that restrict communication to lawyers and immediate family, with every word monitored. The legal challenges to ADEX Florence's conditions are numerous and ongoing. Mental health professionals and civil liberties organizations have argued that the degree of isolation practiced there causes documented psychological damage. Courts have generally upheld the facility's constitutionality while acknowledging the severity of the conditions. For men like El Chapo, who spent years living in the mountains of Sinaloa commanding thousands of people, moving freely, and exercising authority over life and death across large territories, the reduction to a 7x12 cell is a kind of total erasure of everything that defined their existence. It is, in the considered judgment of American federal authorities, the only condition of confinement adequate for individuals whose demonstrated capabilities and external resources make anything less insufficient. That resilience is perhaps the most important and sobering lesson that emerges from all 12 cases together. Every one of these men is now gone from the criminal world. Every one of their organizations adapted and continued. The Sinaloa cartel still operates. The Ching still expands. The Gulf Clan still functions in Colombia. Los Zetas live on in successor factions. The Norte del Valle networks were absorbed into other Colombian structures. The drug trade continues because the fundamental economics sustaining it, persistent consumer demand, the vast profit margin created by prohibition, the logic of trafficking for young men with few other options in the communities these organizations recruit from, have not changed. And yet the removal of each of these individuals mattered in specific and concrete ways, even if it did not end the larger enterprise. Each arrest disrupted specific operational networks that had to be rebuilt from scratch. Each conviction removed a specific individual whose knowledge, relationships, and authority could not be instantly replicated by a successor. Each extradition removed a specific individual from a legal environment where their money and connections might eventually engineer their release and place them in one where such engineering was dramatically harder to accomplish. The aggregate effect of removing 12 of the most significant cartel figures in the history of the modern drug trade, even while acknowledging that the trade continues, is a meaningful contribution to the long-term project of constraining these organizations' power, even if it is not the decisive blow that would end the project entirely. What imprisonment accomplishes, then, is not the end of the enterprise. It is the permanent removal of specific individuals who demonstrated through decades of documented action that they were personally too dangerous, too resourceful, and too deeply connected to criminal power to be allowed anywhere near free society. That is not a small thing, even if it is not the complete answer. These were men who corrupted governments, commanded armies, reshaped the social fabric of entire countries, and generated violence on a scale that staggered international observers. Putting them behind walls that hold, walls from which no amount of money or organizational resources has so far been able to extract them, is what decades of intelligence gathering, legal development, and bilateral cooperation between governments finally produced. Each one of these men now sits in conditions from which escape appears impossible, under restrictions that prevent the direct exercise of the authority they once held over thousands of people. They once flew in private jets to meetings where governments were afraid of what they might demand. They once had more money than they could spend, and more power than most legitimate heads of state ever accumulate. They once commanded the loyalty of thousands who would have killed or died at their word. And today they measure the same concrete floor, going nowhere. The cells are 7 feet by 12 feet. The lights never fully turn off. The world outside those walls continues without them, as it was always going to, eventually, no matter how long it took. Consider what the aggregate of these 12 cases represents. Between them, these men built organizations responsible for moving the majority of the cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana that entered the United States over a period spanning roughly 3 decades. They corrupted police forces, military units, prosecutors, judges, and by credible allegation, at least some national-level political figures in multiple countries. They ordered or authorized the murders of law enforcement officers, journalists, rival cartel members, innocent bystanders, and in some cases entire groups of strangers whose only offense was being in the wrong place at the wrong moment. They operated with a confidence in their own impunity that, for long periods, was entirely justified, because the institutions nominally responsible for containing them were too corrupted, too outgunned, or too frightened to act effectively. They built legends around themselves, some cultivated deliberately, and some arising organically from the communities they came from and operated within, that will outlast their imprisonments and their lives. And they did all of it, starting from poverty, from the margins of societies that offered them few legitimate paths to the power and wealth they craved. That context does not excuse what they did, but it does explain the conditions that made it possible, and understanding those conditions is the only way to begin thinking seriously about whether the next generation of cartel leaders is avoidable, or whether it is simply the inevitable product of circumstances that criminal enforcement alone has never been and will never be sufficient to address. These 12 men are behind walls now, but the world that produced them is still out there, and it is still producing successors. The 12 cases in this documentary also represent, collectively, something significant about the evolution of American federal prosecution. The Eastern District of New York, the Southern District of New York, the Southern District of Texas, the Northern District of Illinois. These courts have handled the most complex and highest-stakes drug trafficking prosecutions in American legal history. The Guzman trial alone involved more than 50 witnesses, thousands of exhibits, and testimony that covered decades of criminal activity across multiple countries. Building those cases required sustained investment by federal agencies over years. The careful cultivation of cooperating witnesses who were themselves significant criminals, and a willingness to make prosecutorial decisions whose complexity and cost would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The development of that prosecutorial capacity and the parallel development of the extradition framework that brought these defendants into American courts represents one of the most significant institutional achievements in the history of American drug enforcement, even as the underlying challenge of stopping the drug trade itself remains unresolved. If this documentary gave you a deeper understanding of the men who built the modern drug trade and the institutions created to contain them permanently, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And tell me, in the comments, of all 12 of these prisoners, which case do you think left the deepest mark on the world we live in today?